Hello and welcome to the latest of our Vega videos looking at the end of the Cold War, and this video will focus very sharply on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is really the last of the major crises that we have to deal with in this part of the course, and it's principally important because it's the single event that ends détente between the superpowers, that period of cooling tensions that characterises most of the late 1960s and 1970s. From the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan onwards, we're really talking about a second Cold War, so a period of rapidly escalating tensions between the two superpowers. Let's start with the basics. Let's start with geopolitics and where is Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is a bit like Berlin. If you don't know where it is, you're going to find it very hard to understand its significance. Well, where is Afghanistan? It's here. It's floating above my left shoulder. No, not really. It's floating between the Soviet Union to its northern borders and the Persian Gulf to its southern borders. So essentially that means that it is midway between one of the world's largest superpowers and the largest source of oil in the world. So Afghanistan, from this point of view, we can already begin to see is an incredibly important power because, after all, both the USA and the Soviet Union depend very, very heavily on oil supply from the Persian Gulf. Neither country can really produce enough oil to keep its economy ticking over, either in this period or today. So, what happened? Well, essentially, in 1979, Prime Minister Asifullah Amin tried to sweep aside the traditional way in which Afghanistan's politics had been governed, which was a very obviously Muslim state, and to replace it with a more communist-leaning regime, so something that looked a lot more like the government in the Soviet Union or in its satellite states. The problem with this was that it was incredibly unpopular, and he was initially assassinated and then replaced by Babrak Kemal, who was also a supporter of a communist way of doing things. But clearly, it was not a popular decision to try and change Afghan tradition. The Soviets claimed that they had been asked not to invade Afghanistan, but to come to the support of the Kemal government. And so they sent Soviet troops and arms across the border in order to reinforce the government. Now, their interest was not simply in propping up another communist regime. Their interest was also in checking the spread of Islamic fundamentalism throughout the region. So if you think back to that map, with Afghanistan on the border of the Soviet Union, Islamic tradition didn't simply stop at the agreed state borders. It spread throughout the region. So large areas of the southern Soviet Union had very significant groups of Islamic their population who followed the Muslim faith. And there was a significant fear that if the population in Afghanistan were able to topple a communist regime, were able to put forward a different type of government, one more in keeping with Islamic tradition, then that might inspire groups inside the Soviet Union to do the same. Initially, opposition to the Soviet invasion was led by the Mujahideen, who were a guerrilla force on a holy mission for Allah. So these were devout Muslims who had, by and large, taken to the hills and fought a guerrilla warfare against a heavily armed Soviet oppressor. And they wanted to overthrow not just the Soviets, but also the Amin government, and as I say, to wind back the clock and really establish a much more traditional type of government in Afghanistan. And to that end, they declared a holy war on the supporters of Amin, including the Soviets. Now, they were not alone in this fight because they won initially secret and increasingly public support from the USA, which consisted of money, of weapons, and of CIA operatives who made their way into Afghanistan in order to provide 20th century military training so that they could fight the Mujahideen could fight a more effective campaign against the Soviets. And as I say, this is important because it's what we call a proxy war. The USA did not declare public support, or the government of the USA did not declare public support for the Mujahideen, but very significant elements of the right wing within the United States were pretty public in saying that the Soviet invasion was illegitimate and the Mujahideen had to be supported both financially and militarily in order to kick the Soviets out. Now, President Carter, who had up until this point been very actively negotiating the SALT II treaty, which you'll have seen from an earlier video, he changed his tune rather dramatically after the invasion of Afghanistan. Carter pronounced something called the Carter Doctrine, which committed the USA to the defence of the Persian Gulf. Now, this was obviously rooted in the fact that the Gulf was the source of about a third of the world's oil reserves, and Carter needed to draw a line in the sand at Afghanistan, which meant that the USSR would not obtain undue influence over the Gulf, because you can imagine, If the USSR had control of oil reserves, then there would be a very significant problem for the United States. And you can see President Carter behind me, who is there welcoming the Shah of Iran on a visit to the United States. And clearly, the Shah of Iran, who was deposed in 1979 by an Islamic revolution, was himself a significant source of, or the country was a significant source of oil exports to the United States. So the Islamic revolution in Iran, which is not a core part of our syllabus, but clearly is going on at this time, made the defense of Afghanistan by the Mujahideen with covert support from the US all the more important. It made the Carter Doctrine all the more important for US foreign policy, because that was another part of the Gulf that was in turmoil at this point, another part of the Gulf where oil supplies were at risk. Now, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, on the face of it, is the case of a world superpower invading pretty much a third world country. And normally we would expect only one outcome, right? Wrong. Well, much as was the case in Vietnam, the Afghans proved more than a match for their superpower invaders because they fought a completely different war than that which their invaders were comfortable with. So Afghanistan very quickly became Russia's Vietnam. It was also an internationally unpopular war. It damaged relations with the USA tremendously. The US boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and then the Soviet Union did exactly the same thing when the Olympics were held in Los Angeles. Those are just two very public symbols of the way in which relations between the USA and the Soviet Union had deteriorated, in significant part because of the impact of the invasion of Afghanistan. It also provided a very public and visible symbol of Soviet oppression. So much like the invasions of Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, it was an example of how the Soviet Union was prepared to venture beyond its borders and use its military might to get its way in foreign affairs. And the invasion, although it was long-standing, it lasted for almost 10 years, it was really pretty clear after about 1985 that it wasn't going to be successful. And certainly after the appointment of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, it was clear that the invasion was not going to succeed or be sustained. So over the course of the late 1980s, culminating in the withdrawal of 1989, it was clear that the Soviet military presence had to be scaled down. Now this was not without significant cost. I mean, the Soviets lost about 14,500 troops on active service in Afghanistan. And although those deaths were largely hushed up at the time, remember, the press in the Soviet Union was very, very heavily controlled, so people did not have free access to information. It was very clear that this was not a popular war, even at home. So by the late 1980s, there was very little political will to carry on fighting in Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union began the process of withdrawal. The real significance of the war, as far as the course is concerned, is of course the impact it has on superpower relations, which is close to calamitous in the early 1980s.